Good evening, everyone. So great to see you virtually. I'm so happy to welcome you. This is the first of a three-part mini course on women in Yiddish literature. I am Nancy Sinkoff, the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and professor of Jewish Studies and History here at Rutgers, New Brunswick. I want to give you the ground rules about how we're running the course, and then I will introduce Dr. Anita Norwich, the instructor, an extremely important figure in Yiddish literary history, translation, and Yiddish and Jewish letters. So here are the ground rules. This is a webinar format, so all of you are muted. If you want to ask a question, please type it into the chat and I will be moderating it throughout the sessions, all three sessions. I will pose the questions to Professor Norwich at two junctures in the hour, an hour, 5 minutes, whatever we take. At a natural pause, we will stop and I will then pose your questions to the first series of texts that we're looking at and then at the end. So please don't hesitate. And again, I will curate or moderate the questions for Dr. Norwich. The mini course sessions are being recorded and they will be available on the Bildner Center website in a few days. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Dr. Anita Norwich to you. I've known Professor Norwich for a long time. I rely on her work in so many junctures. I cannot tell you because she is really the go-to person on modern Yiddish literature in many, many ways. And she is officially the Tikva Frimerkensky Collegiate Professor Emerita of English and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, where she worked for many years and trained many, many young scholars in Yiddish literature and American letters, as I said. Her most recent book of many books is entitled A Jewish Refugee in New York. It was published in 2019. And it is a translation of a Yiddish novel by Kadia Molodovsky, an extremely important East European Jewish immigrant writer. Professor Norwich is also the author of Writing in Tongues, Yiddish Translation in the 20th Century, Discovering Exile, Yiddish and Jewish American Literature in America during the Holocaust, The Homeless Imagination in the Fiction of Israel Joshua Singer, that's Bashevis Singer's better writing brother, and co-editor of Languages of Modern Jewish Cultures, Comparative Perspectives, Jewish Literary Cultures, Context and Intertext, and Gender and Text in Modern Yiddish and Hebrew Literatures. Dr. Norwich is assiduously involved right now with translation. This is kind of what she is devoting all of her talents to make accessible for non-Yiddish readers the extraordinary corpus of modern Yiddish writing. And so much of it is unknown, and there is so much of it, and it touches on all of the major issues of modern life. And we await all of her work with great expectation. She still teaches, as you can see, and you get to benefit from this 3-session mini course, women's Yiddish literature. And I wanted to say that we love doing these mini courses for the public. They're extremely well attended. And this particular course is funded by the Sagner Family Foundation, and we're very grateful for their support. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Dr. Norwich, and I will only come back when I am posing questions. So please don't be shy. Questions, not comments. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite an introduction. I had at some point thought of calling this series, What Do Women Want? But the answer to that here is actually fairly simple. Inclusion might be one of the words that we want. One of the reasons that I've been looking for and translating Yiddish works by women is not only because they've been left out of much of the discussion, but because they change the way, in ways that I hope to be able to show in the next couple of weeks, they change the way in which we understand both modern Yiddish culture and modern Jewish literatures writ large. In the 1970s, as I know many of you know, American feminist criticism was concerned with uncovering, discovering, finding texts. English has gone well beyond that. Yiddish, unfortunately, has not. I don't want to refer to works that have been discovered, because this is a little bit like Columbus discovering America. It's there, it's hiding in plain sight for the most part, but it's been limited by the sense that we know what's there, or we knew what was there, and so people haven't been looking for it until recent decades. I want to do a couple of things, or raise a couple of questions in these weeks, and today will be a little, or at least the first half of this will be a little more general, and then we will do what I most like to do, which is to look at individual texts and analyze them. Women's literature in Yiddish, like ethnic literatures more broadly, are often understood as autobiographical, as memoirs, as confessional in some way. And I want to avoid that. I want to avoid that sense of it. I will contextualize them historically and politically, both the writers and their work. But to see this literature as autobiographical or as confessional is to negate a lot of the artistry that goes into fiction and poetry writing. It suggests that there is less imagination and more confession that's going on in these texts than I think we will see. I also want us to keep in mind what we mean individually and collectively by good or bad literature. I'm always asked this when I speak about some version of this topic, right? They're interesting historically, these women writers, but are they any good? And I have to confess to not understanding that question, since it's implicated in the history of taste and in individual tastes. As modern or postmodern readers, we tend to privilege difficulty. We tend to privilege our own ability to figure things out. And we'll see how that applies here. It's worth keeping in mind that the reputations, the fates of many writers change over both their lifetime and after their lifetime. You may recall that it was only in recent decades that Kafka was considered a Jewish writer. He was always a Czech writer, but those Jewish elements were less significant. George Eliot, the great English novelist, was basically unknown after her death and then rediscovered. So we're in that kind of a period. What we don't have is a history of women writing Yiddish literature. We don't have enough information to yet produce that. But however we would produce it, it would have to consider the status of Yiddish as what it's called as Mama Lashon, as the mother tongue. Mama Lashon invokes a kind of homey, comfortable, quite deliberately and to some extent, well, we'll see how accurately. Mama Lashon is really, the notion of Yiddish as Mama Lashon is directly, I think, linked to the Haskalah, to the Enlightenment, to the Jewish Enlightenment. The motto of the Enlightenment among Jews was zu sein a Yidin daheim und a Mensch auf der Gas, to be a Jew at home and a Mensch, a regular human being, an upstanding human being in the street. And what that meant was that Jewish things of all sorts were confined to the home, or were meant to be confined to the home. Of course, they never were. Clothing, certainly religious ritual, and language, so that Yiddish was coded as the language of the home. At the same time, from fairly early on in modern Yiddish literature, and modern Yiddish literature really only dates, although we'll go back earlier, modern Yiddish literature really only dates from the 19th century on. But when Shalom Aleichem, the great Shalom Aleichem, referred to Mendel Sfarim, then the most well-known voice in Yiddish letters, when he referred to Mendel Sfarim, or the author's name, Shin Yud Abramovich, he referred to him as der Zayde, the grandfather of Yiddish literature. And it was a brilliant move, not so much for women, but it was a brilliant move. in that it suggested that there was a history of Yiddish literature that was respectable. I mean, think of the difference between Mame and Zayde, right? And not just the feminine and the masculine, but the Zayde is someone who we are meant to think of as kind, as knowing, as conveying knowledge, but also as a little old-fashioned. That is, Shalom Aleichem was saying, there's a Zayde, and I'm the Anikel, and I'm the grandchild, and here's the tradition. So what I'm saying here is that the language was coded as feminine and feminized, domesticated, and the literature was coded as masculine. At the same time, women were considered to be the primary consumers of Yiddish literature, the readers of Yiddish literature, from the earliest days on. The earliest important text here, there are earlier ones, is the Tzenorene, the so-called Women's Bible, that has both biblical stories and explanations and explanations, I think will do it. And that, which appeared at the end of the 16th century, was subtitled For Women and Men Who Are Like Women, which meant those who didn't know Hebrew. And here we begin what continues until, really until the creation of the State of Israel, the language wars between Hebrew and Yiddish, where again, Hebrew was considered the masculine domain, and Yiddish was again considered the feminine, the female domain. I'm going to want to talk next time more about particularly the American context, but also about the difference between the way in which women are considered in poetry and women are considered in prose. It was long thought, or it was long argued by critics, that women primarily wrote poetry, or they wrote domestic novels, what were called domestic novels. And I'm going to argue, and I think you will see, that domestic only means something if we think of domestic as trying to establish a home in the face of war and revolution and upheaval and economic changes and all the rest that we will be familiar with, we are familiar with. There were some very interesting, I'm going back now a century, almost exactly a century, about 100 years ago, there were a series of exchanges in a Warsaw journal, a very good journal called Literarische Blätter, literary leaves or pages. And the editor of that journal, a well-known writer, Melechowicz, wrote an essay, and I'm just going to quote the title of that essay to give you an idea of what was in the essay. He called the essay that he wrote about women in Yiddish literature, Mädlich, Frauen, Weiber, Jiddische Dichterins. Girls, women, Weiber is really wives, but I'm going to translate it as ladies. Girls, women, ladies, Yiddish poetesses. And basically what he, besides being a very condescending title, it was a condescending view of those, of the emerging modern Yiddish women writers in Eastern Europe, who were on their way also into America. He said that they were not as steeped in Jewish learning as the men, and therefore they couldn't produce anything worthy of Jewish literature, worthy to be called Jewish literature. He said that they had gone after what he called foreign gods. That is, they had dabbled in other literatures and therefore were not, again, in their own world, in their own cultural world. This is an argument, lest you are sort of laughing about this, this is an argument that we are hearing to this day. Kadra Molodowski, whom Professor Sinkov just mentioned a moment ago, Kadra Molodowski wrote a scathing response to this, in which she said, Ravitch and other men, it wasn't just him, I'm using him as an example, created what she called an Ezras Nashim, an Ezrat Nashim, a women's section of Yiddish literature, and that was a way of separating them and not having to take them quite as seriously. This is another version of separate, but definitely not equal. I also want to mention, in sort of broad terms, the different status of, particularly of storytelling in Jewish culture for men and for women. Men are said to tell stories, to narrate, zwischen Mincha and Ma'ariv, between the afternoon prayers and the evening prayers. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, that there's a little gap there between the afternoon prayers and sunset, when evening prayers can begin. And there are stories religious stories, explanations, there are stories, narratives that are told between those hours, or between those moments. Women, on the other hand, are said to have 9 mozred, 9 measures of talk. What does that mean? It means they talk too much, that they have no limit. And people who tend to talk too much tend to say less than they ought to, in this view. There is no one master narrative that we're going to be able to trace when we talk about Yiddish women's literature, certainly not a linear one. They were as diverse as any of the men who wrote at the same times. And they women began writing and publishing in Yiddish since the late 16th, early 17th century. And primarily what they began with were trinis, that is, petitionary supplications, private devotions that took on a role similar to liturgy, and that were sometimes written by women or written by men for women. And it's hard to distinguish which is which. And there are 2 primary reasons for the rise of this literature, of this trinis literature. One is the rise of Kabbalistic writings, of Jewish mystical writings. Kabbalah popularized a kind of mystical piety, and an individual one, right? It spoke to individuals of God. And the trinis were hugely influenced by that. That's one. The second is the rise of printing. Suddenly, these things were able to be disseminated. Not so suddenly, it takes a while, but they were able to be disseminated in a way that they had not been before. In printed trina collections, you have a prayer that begins with a heading that directs when and how this prayer should be recited. So that, for example, I'm going to share my screen, which I think you can see. If not, Professor Simkov will
We can
tell
see
me.
it, no problem.
Thank you. Okay, so here's something that women should say when lighting candles on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. May it be granted that you will give me children who will learn the Torah and who will love you and fear you. You give us commandments for everything, even a commandment for how a man should walk his horse, so he may practice what Moses put in the Torah, right? So it's telling you when, and it's telling you what, and it's asking for specific things. There are trinas for coming out of the ritual bath. There are trinas to say at birth, at death, of course. And the majority of them are connected to women's spiritual lives. That is, the 3 commandments to women. What do you say when you take a piece of challah for that the dough for the Sabbath, when you separate it, that's a commandment to women. What do you say when what in addition to the prayer do you say when you light the Sabbath or Yontif holiday candles? What do you say in order to maintain nida, a marital separation during menstruation, right? What are these things that are particular to women, and when not only when do you say them, but what is it that you say, so that we have, if I can, here we go. So here's, I'm not going to read all of these. I sent them to you, and you know, you should consider them in your own time. But here, what is being asked for here is becoming pregnant in purity, raising your children, good health, keeping kosher, not blaspheming or desecrating the Sabbath or festivals, protect me from bad thoughts when I lie in my bed. That is not subtle. May I lie safely at rest. This one always gives me pause. Do not allow me to be smothered by my covers. I'm curious about sleeping habits in when this was written, but nonetheless, it's a prayer for long life, in effect. And it also has clearly an ethical dimension, right? Let us not crave great houses and beautiful clothes, but let us desire only what we need. And let us not set ourselves apart from those who have nothing, but unite all good people so our children show great respect to those who fear you and love you greatly, and so on. The first major collection of Tchinas was published anonymously in Amsterdam in the mid-17th century. And there have been, I won't say infinite, but certainly numerous reprints and additional collections following that book of Tchinas, from which these Tchinas are taken. Another interesting thing to keep in mind about the Tchinas is that they were also used by the Maskilim, by the Enlighteners, the so-called Enlighteners, the followers of the Jewish Enlightenment. And again, you'll remember that the motto of that was to be a Jew at home and a regular person in the street. And there it is believed that it was primarily men, Maskilim, although we're going to see an exception, another example of an exception in a moment. It was primarily men who wrote pseudo-Tchinas that were designed to teach the new ways that the Enlightenment was preaching. So that, for example, you saw the Tchinas asking for health, the traditional Tchinas asking for health, for the children, for oneself, for a healthy pregnancy. Maskilim would reproduce that, but they'd also stress the importance of hygiene, of proper hygiene, right? So you can ask God for health, but you better wash your hands, is basically the idea there. And this genre of writing is often considered to be the beginnings of women's literature in Yiddish, although clearly it is not modern literature, but traditional literature in Yiddish. And the story that I asked you to read that I want to discuss in greater detail, the story by Rachel Bruchis called The Zugerin, is one such remaking in a very modern and not Tchina-like way of the Tchina genre. I can stop here for a couple of moments.
I think let's have a minute to give you be able to breathe. And there is a question. I think someone would like again, just for you to maybe underscore the explanation of the dissemination of the Tchina literature in the 16th century, and what were the causes of that. And I think that it's such a good question because it tells us that literature exists in a historical context. It's not just because it's good or it's bad. There are social reasons and sometimes political reasons why certain literature enters. So can you just, I think, reiterate that point for our
Okay,
public?
so I was saying, and if this isn't what you were asking, I apologize, and because you may notice that when I have a compressed amount of time, I speak. So if this went by too quickly, or if it's a different question, please ask it again. There were two main reasons for the greater dissemination of Tchinas in the 17th century in particular, late 16th, 17th century. One that is sometimes overlooked, but I think is very important, of course, is the printing press, is the greater availability of texts that can be disseminated, that can be read. You saw, or either you saw or you will see an example of this in, again, that story that I'm about to talk about, the Zugiden. Why do we need a Zugiden? Why do we need somebody who reads the prayers for the women's section? Because not everybody has books and not everybody is literate. But at least with the printing press, there is a possibility for more of this. And there's the other reason that I suggested was the rise in Kabbalistic, that is mystical teachings, which allowed for, or even one might even say encouraged, a more personal response to religious questions, and not only rational ones. That's the nature of mysticism, right? Both of these encouraged women both to read and to write in Yiddish these kinds of prayers.
So I have a question that's always, I guess, bugged me about the Tchinas. To what degree do we really know whether or not women wrote these themselves versus, and they're clearly, look, they're part of the women's world. There's no doubt about that. And we know there are ritual practices that are associated with Tchinas. You and I were talking about the measuring of the wicks for candles based on the gravestones, the headstones of departed relatives. So we know there's a women's piety. We know there are the three commandments that are Chana, right? The taking of the Chala Nida, the marital laws of sexual activity, and lighting of candles. But to what degree really can we say women are writing the Tchinas, or is it just one of those we're never going to know and we just have to live with the ambiguity?
I stopped saying we're never going to know when I started making lists of women who had written Yiddish after being told that they just didn't do it. It's a lost cause.
Right.
So I don't know if we're ever going to know. I don't believe that we do know. Right. Some of them, I mean, there are some that we can clearly attribute to men or women. The Maskilic Tchinas were almost surely written by men for women. Some of the earlier Tchinas were traceably written by women, but what the vast majority, how the vast majority were produced is not something that I can answer, certainly, and I don't know that it can be answered yet.
Yet. No, that's good. Yet is good. Yet is good in time. So there's another question that I want to raise, but I also want to just make a note. As you said, the rise of Kabbalistic teachings, that also goes hand in hand with the printing press. I mean, the accessibility and popularization, so to speak, of Kabbalistic ideas partly is, again, there's a reason why the printing press was a revolution, right? So yeah. And we have lots and lots of ethical and moral books that are chapbooks that are published in the early modern period because of the printing press. So someone is posing the question, it's a really fine one, outside of Ashkenaz, do we know of any of this kind of writing, wouldn't be called Tchinas, which is of course the Ashkenazic pronunciation of Tchinot, outside of Ashkenaz. So do we have any other evidence of women's petitionary devotional prayers in other languages outside of the world of Ashkenaz? And if you don't know, that, yeah.
This is where I plead complete ignorance.
Okay, gotcha.
I don't know. There have been modern trinas written in English and in European languages. Whether there is a tradition of this among Mizrahim or Sephardim, I would guess there is some such tradition.
Right.
Because the social conditions, different as they were not so different for men and women as we might like. So it's a good guess, but I'm
next
not
course,
sure. And
the next course,
the next course, or
right.
The next life. The other thing that I think is important that I didn't mention, but that I think I take as an important motivation for trinas is that, as you know, there's a prayer in Yiddish, there's a blessing in Yiddish for everything a human being can do. The first time this and the first time that, and the daily, every day when you wash your hands before a meal, and every meal when you eat, and going to the bathroom, and whatever, haircut, the first hair, everything has a prayer, except things that have to do with women. That is pregnancy, God forbid, miscarriage, first menses, end of menstruation. Those do not have prayers. So it makes sense to me that there would be a desire to fill in then. What do you do when you have to say a prayer over every activity in human life except those that have to do with women's bodies?
Right. Okay. So one more question, because we want to get on to the other text.
Yes,
so
please.
Someone was just curious, how do we know much about the distribution of the earliest trinas? And were they chapbooks? Do we know the edition history? And if you don't, we can just, it's a good question, but
it is a good question. The earliest Sfarim, I can't call them Sfarim because they were for women, but the earliest publications really do date from this period of the broadening of both Kabbalah and printing. They were printed as chapbooks. They were disseminated individually and collectively. They were reissued, as in the example from Seder Trinas that I just read from.
Okay, great. So everyone, just hold on to those questions. If yours wasn't posted, it's because we are aware of the time, and we're going to move on to the next text. Thank you.
I'm on strict orders to keep to a time. So let's talk briefly about, are we there? Yes, about, oh, we missed it, about Rachel Brachas story, the Zogerin. I don't have a picture of Rachel Brachas. There's none to be found. I'd like to think that one of those women standing behind me might be her, but she's not. Here too, I'll talk about the title in a moment, but just to make the transition from what we were saying earlier about Trinas and this, you'll see some of the same language in this story. And the story was written sometime between 1922. Rachel Brachas, who came from Minsk and was murdered in the Minsk ghetto, would have been very familiar with this tradition, certainly is using it. There's a kind of intertextual exchange here. So here, Rabbeinu Shalom, kind Father, you alone know how I have prayed both summer and winter, never missed a Shabbos, never stinted on a trina. On their behalf, what have I not prayed for? Wealth, length of days, pleasure from the children. Actually, that's not what the trinas pray for. They don't pray for wealth. They may pray for length of days. Pleasure from the children is a bit of a stretch. And comes Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. My heart melts. It's no small thing. I pray for everything, everything. Keep that in mind. I pray for everything, weep for everything. Every year I leave the synagogue. Now, what you might expect here is every year I leave the synagogue uplifted by my prayer, thinking of you, O Lord. I mean, I can think of very many ways to end that sentence. Every year I leave the synagogue absolutely sick, hoarse, distraught, worn out. Had I been chopping wood or digging ditches, I couldn't have worked so hard. It's no small thing to be a zugivim. It's a rather startling ending to this series of supplications. Rachel Bruchas was actually quite a well-known writer. She published her first story when she was 19, so right at the turn of the century, the turn into the 20th century. And she published in New York and in Russia. And this also is worth keeping in mind about Yiddish literature, that it really is an international literature, not only because the writers kept moving, not Bruchas herself, but certainly others, not only because the writers kept moving, but because their texts also migrated, sometimes before the writers. That is, works that were written in Eastern Europe could be published, were published. Publication laws were quite different, were pirated in some cases, were published in the Americas, and vice versa. And her main theme, I hope you had a chance to read the story, her main theme really is the poverty within the Jewish community and the way in which it's treated, so that she takes on the question of tzedakah, of charity. What does it mean to be charitable? And clearly within this story, no one is. I don't have a definitive answer to this question, but I think it's worth asking. I'm as you heard, I'm very interested and very involved in translation these days or these years. And I'm curious about why the translator doesn't translate zogevim, which means speaker simply, although it has a religious overtone. Both why she doesn't translate it and how you might translate it. The women's reader, the women's section, declaimer, they're all a little clunky. But what the Zugin is, I think, asking us to examine are two major questions with a bunch of sub-questions. One of them, of course, is how do we understand the relationship of rich and poor, between the rich and the poor? Clearly, this is not a charitable community. They disdain her requests, they reject her requests for help in raising her grandson. They're Bruchas is pointing to a kind of religious hypocrisy here, I think. Save that thought for a moment. There is a clear recognition here that poverty, which is sometimes described, not by anybody I know, but has been described as somehow ennobling, right? The purity of it, you're not weighed down by material things, and you rise up, and the story is like an American Alger Hiss story, right? You rise above it. But for Bruchas and this story, poverty is something that deforms the character, that can't be risen above, or isn't risen above because of what the community does. This is in very many ways a Maskilic text, an Enlightenment text. What is being argued for here is not upward mobility, but simply equity, equality. And the other major question is prayer. How do we understand prayer? Who is she speaking to? Right? Prayers are directed to God, but here it seems that the prayers are directed to the women who are demanding the prayers of her. Who's hearing these prayers? And I think within that question, there is a real, again, Maskilic enlightenment question, which is, why do we need a Zugin? Why do we need somebody who reads prayers for women? That is, why can't women be taught to read the prayers? There is that underneath this story as well. There's a question of, can you really pray for somebody else? I mean, Jews don't have this intercessor to God. Can you pray for somebody else? And what is it that you can pray for? You should not be praying for material goods. You should not be praying for things. And yet, here we have one. And at the end, Brachas, at the end, the Zugerim, who has been deformed by this endless poverty, utters a prayer in which she says, I am praying a prayer of revenge. That phrase really, I find really striking. A prayer of revenge. That turns prayer on its head. And I want to suggest that it's not that Brachas doesn't believe in prayer or is arguing against prayer. Quite the opposite, I think. It's not the nature of prayer or the need for it that's being questioned. What's being questioned is the modern, late 19th, early 20th century, the modern perversion of prayer. She's taking it seriously, and that's why Brachas is taking it seriously, and that's why she's so furious about it. In some ways, this story is reminiscent of the biblical prophets railing, but it's not quite Job-like either, right? Because she's not addressing God, and she's not reconciling with God. She's not trusting in God. She's addressing the community. And it's a rebuke of the community. So you see that we've moved away from traditional trinas, which are invoked in that opening that I quoted. We've moved away from traditional trinas, which were supplications for the self, pregnancy, body, life, don't let me be smothered by the covers, were supplications for the self and for one's family. Particular ones, may I raise the children to be God-fearing. And here we have a story about the community and its perversions. God is not in this story. And it's the absence of God that I think is underlining the power of this story about saying prayers. Okay, I want to move inelegantly, but seriously, to modern literature, to more modern literature, beginning with what is possibly the most well-known poem by a woman poet, certainly the most well-known poem by this woman, Anna Margolin. I saw in this is a little aside, I saw in the list of participants some familiar names, which I'm delighted to see, although I can't see you, which is really frustrating. So some of you will no doubt be familiar with Anna Margolin, and will forgive my going over some of the material that may not be familiar to everyone. Margolin lived all over the place. When I say Yiddish writers moved around, She's a good example of it. Odessa, Warsaw, New York, London, Paris, briefly in Palestine. She came to New York first at the age of 18 to study, but she quickly became involved in the artistic life of Yiddish New York and published her first story. She's known primarily as a poet, but published her first story in the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which was a Jewish anarchist newspaper. She left, she married, she divorced, she married, I should say this in a different order. She married, she had a child whom she left in Tel Aviv with her then husband. She returned, she became an editor of a newspaper, of a well-known daily, Der Tag, and wrote a weekly women's column there. She traveled to Europe. I mean, this is a really important woman. She used many pen names, many pseudonyms during her writing career. And the last man, it's interesting, in some sense, in some texts, in some biographies, she is said to have married the Yiddish poet Reuven Iceland. English writers tend to say that she married him. Yiddish writers tend to say that they lived together, which I think is probably most correct. But Reuven Iceland wrote about, commented at some point about the first time that she published. She published a poem, she published a volume of poems in 1929, the only volume that she ever published. And she published it, her name was Rosa Lebensboim, and she published it under the name Anna Margolin. And the critics didn't believe that this poetry was written by a woman. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But what Reuven Iceland wrote in his own memoir was, the general opinion was that it must certainly be a man. These poems were written by an experienced hand, and a woman can't write like that, end quote. Right? Now, the reason that male critics were so suspicious of this text as being written by a woman is because they had been fooled twice about this. Men, it's a well-known tradition both in Hebrew and Yiddish literature, Hebrew and Yiddish texts, that men took pseudonyms, often the names of books that they had written, or personae that they assumed, like Mendel Amachasfarim for Abramovich or Shalom Aleichem for Shalom Rabinovich. But there were two poets, two very famous poets who became very famous poets, Halpern, Moshe Leib Halpern, and Yankiv Glatstein, who, when they sent in their first poems to be published in the press, they were rejected. And they, each of them, took a woman's name, Frida Halpern in one case, Clara Bloom in another, and resent the very same poems, and they were accepted. Because it was believed that women were the primary readers of literature and of Yiddish. And if you're writing poetry, well, poetry just isn't a man's genre. It's got to be a woman's genre, except when it gets to be good poetry, in which case it must have been written by a man. That is the only, as far as I can tell, the only time that men took women's names as their own pseudonyms were when, like Halpern and Glatstein, they published their very first poems before they were well known, before they were known at all, or when they were writing what is known in Yiddish as shund, that is serialized, what we'd call dime novels or trashy novels, because that's what women ought to be writing. So that's what they're writing in the eyes of these critics. So as I was saying, her most famous poem is this one, which has been translated many times. And I'm using the translation by Marcia Falk, but I'll talk about others as well. A poem that's called Once I Was Young. I'm going to read this in Yiddish because it's short and you can follow it along in English if your Yiddish isn't quite what it might become. Ich bin gewesen einmal ein Jüngling. Ich bin gewesen einmal ein Jüngling, gehört den Portikos Sokraten. Es hat mein Bosemfeind, mein Liebling, gehabt dem schönsten Torsenaten. Gewesen Cäsar und eine helle Welt gebeut von Marmor. Ich der Letzte und für ein Weib mir aus der Wald, mein stolze Schwester. Oh no, I've just lost it. I'm so sorry. Okay. In Rosenkranz beim Wein bis spät, gehärt in hochmutigen Frieden wegen Schwachling von Nazareth und wilde Meises wegen Jiden. All right, so you'll notice a number of things here, but the one that I want to point to first is this very word Yingling, right? Ich bin gewesen einmal ein Yingling. You may hear the word Yingle, boy. But the Yingling is just not a construction in Yiddish that's familiar in Yiddish. And it's been translated by different translators in various ways. I was young, as here. I was once a lad. I was once a handsome boy, which is giving it a little more than it merits. I was once a youth. I was once a boy. People are having trouble with this word Yingling. Because if you know Yiddish grammar at all, you will remember that Yingle, like Nadel, girl and boy, are neuter nouns. All nouns in Yiddish, of course, are gendered, but a boy and a girl don't have a gendered article. They're neuter, grammatically, I mean. So here we have this Yingle, but here we have the name Anna Margolin. So this is starting out as confusing and deliberately so. And it starts out like some nostalgic Yiddish song or poem, right? I was once young. So we may be expecting what that youth consisted of. It sounds interesting to go on. But of course, this couldn't have been experienced by any youth or any human being, right? We go from the Greeks, we go to the Romans, we go to early Christianity and the exploits of the Jews, which is a distancing way of talking about the Jews. So we have a series of transgressions here. And the one I pointed out first is simply the linguistic transgression. But of course, there's also sexual transgression invoked here, right? My pal, my lover, well, the Greeks, right? A male lover. Then incest, certainly transgressive. And then these transgressions of the Jewish world. What she doesn't claim as an identity here, what the speaker of this poem doesn't claim as an identity, is either being a woman or being a Jew. And it's worth asking why. Not that I have an answer to that. But clearly, this is a poem that says, don't define me. We sort of sing this awkward, don't fence me in, but it really is, don't define me. I want to be, this is the poem that reminds me more of Walt Whitman than anyone else. That is, I encompass multitudes. I am all of these things, and you can't keep me from being all of these at once. Margolin had a quite bitter side. She wrote her own epitaph, and the underlying part of this is, say that until her death she guarded with bare hands the fierceness of that, the fire entrusted to her in which she finally burned, and say how in spirited hours she struggled hard with God, and how her blood sang deep and small men ruined her. This is in many ways an awkward place to stop, because it suggests that anger and transgression are central themes in women's writing, in Yiddish women's writing. And as I'm hoping we'll see in the coming couple of meetings, that's not the only tone that we ought to focus on. That is that the range here is broad. There's socialist realist fiction, there's lyrical poetry, there's erotic literature, there's nostalgia, there is the Holocaust and politics, both American and Israeli, and everything else that one might hope for in this literature.
So thank you. There are two questions that are coming up through the chat. She wrote her own epitaph. Is it on her matzeva?
Yeah.
It is.
It's slightly different, the one that's on her matzeva, but yes, this was a tradition of Yiddish writers, from Shalom Aleichem wrote his own epitaph.
Mm-hmm.
There is this tradition, yeah.
I think it's a tradition of people very strong egos and want the last word. Right?
Writers tend
don't
to
you
that.
think, it's like designating your biographer, right?
Right. Well, let's not do Philip Roth here. Right.
Yeah. I was thinking Betty Friedan, also her epitaph, I think she chose. But I've another question, which is obviously, you selected three little insights for us, and I know. But I am curious about one thing. You said, and I love that, it's not that people are being rediscovered, it's that they were hiding in plain sight. To what degree does a woman write, like a female writer like Anna Margolin, who's, maybe she just wanted to be a writer, not a female writer, but to what degree do they have a sense of their antecedents? Do they see themselves in a tradition of writing that perhaps men are ignoring, but they know that they have?
This is a very interesting question, both about women and about Yiddish literature in general. And there's a tension within Yiddish within Yiddish literature and writers. There's a tension, and I'm going to say this in general, not just about women, between, we have a history, we have a tradition, right? And nothing has ever come before me. In French, people say après moi le déluge. In
Right.
Yiddish, we would say before me, there is nothing. There's just nothing.
Tohu and bohu. Right.
Tohu bohu. So, I can give you a long list of literary groups that called themselves some version of the Young Turks, the Young Vilna, Young Yisrael, the Chalyastre, the New Gang, all of these. And the same thing is true in women's writings. The Brachas is clearly picking up from Trinis and knows that tradition well, but she's also saying something new with it. There are some interesting projects that some people are undertaking now of looking at women's letters to one another or comments about one another. And they were friends. There's a huge, we tend to think when we say the Junge or the Inzuchisten in America, we name the men. And then, sometimes people say, oh, and Anna Margolin, she also wrote, and Molodowski, very important. But these women were in correspondence with one another, not all of them, obviously. And I think if there is one generalizable thing that one could say about them is that they were more generous to one another than most of the male writers were to one another. That is, to other male writers.
Right. So there is one more question from the chat, which I hope we can take the time for, and then I'll close up for tonight, but happily we have 2 more sessions. So the question is, what kind of educational background do we know that these women writers had, and could they benefit from higher education? Were they autodidacts? What do we know? And again, we have many different people, so it might be hard to generalize.
We do have very many different people, and higher education has a different meaning, certainly for the period that I'm describing. That is, nobody went to graduate school. Although I see that many of the people on this call went to graduate school or in graduate school.
And also people in the interwar years in Poland, we know there were female graduate students of history.
That's right. History and medicine and dentistry and, you know, the things that were allowable both for Jews and in many cases for women. They were certainly excluded from yeshivas, but frankly, the men in the modern period were not interested in it either, for the most part. They had, Rachel Bruchas, for example, the daughter of a maskil, of a follower of the Enlightenment, had an excellent Hebrew education, and obviously a Yiddish one as well. These were women who read, almost every one of them, who read various languages, were fluent in various literatures, literary traditions. Some were autodidacts, clearly, as were many of the male writers. Remember that this is still, I mean, we're still in the period where reading non-religious texts is eye-opening and new and exciting, both for men and women. But they were well, I want to say well educated, but I think it's more accurate to say they were learned.
Right, nice. Right, there was a time when people got learning without getting a degree slapped on at the end. So thank you so much, Professor Norwich. And to everyone out there, I want to just give you some homework. You have the texts for next week and for the week after, and you will be enriched by doing some preparation. So it is my job as a professor to remind students to do the homework. So you can just listen to, but it will just be deeper for you if you've experienced the text on your own before listening to our expert guide. So we'll see you next week, same time, same bad channels. We used to say 7 o'clock. And I want to remind everyone that the Bildner Center has one more public program that's not a course, and that's on December 9th with Professor Leah Garrett from Hunter, who's also a scholar of Yiddish literature. Her first book was on Yiddish travelogues, and she will be speaking on her newest book, which is called X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II. So it should be terrific. She's a great speaker, and that's in person, actually, December 9th. Oh. So stay safe, stay warm. Good night to everyone. And thank you, Dr. Norwich. We'll see everyone next Monday.
Thank you.